In 1953, having had a profound experience the previous year, made a decision to seek out graduate education in group dynamics. And the school that seemed to be offering that to me, for me, was Boston University, especially group dynamics as related to outdoor camping, which I was very involved in. Now, I had never heard of a T group, so I didn't go to Boston for a T group. And who would have thought any university, 6 years after the T group was invented, would be having a T group as part of the curriculum? That's pretty amazing. And yet Ken Benny, one of the three first, with Leland Bradford and Ronald Lippett, who were, let's say, students or at least associates working under Kurt Levine. Ken Benny was at Boston University. The fascinating thing was I got there and I talked to, it was a school of theology, where I located some studies I wanted. And I got there and talked to Walter Holcomb, who was my professor. And he said, well, we don't have a course about group dynamics, but we have a course in group dynamics. Okay, Dr. Holcomb. You know, I didn't know what he was talking about. But of course it was a T group. So I was all of a sudden in a group where we were looking at our dynamics. I was stunned by this. And while there was certainly a lot of personal growth in it, and interpersonal growth, a major thing in the early T group was looking at the group processes. How do we decide what we were just talking about? Who influences who? Who interrupts who? What are the norms being developed here about openness or not openness? How are we handling emotionality? How are we resolving any conflicts that come into group? And indeed, our group was interracial, as was the first T group, incidentally, which was developed by Kurt Levine at a specific request of, I believe it was the state of New Hampshire, but a New England state, to help him deal with, help them deal with interracial issues they were having at the state level. So the T group was birthed in that, which would have been huge for Kurt Levine, because he was very much into resolving social conflicts. To him, all this was about resolving social conflicts. Democracy helped to resolve it, because as the Boyce study clearly showed in the 30s, the group that was led by a Democratic leader, when the leader would leave the room, kept working. The groups that were led by authoritarian or permissive leaders, when the leader left the room, they would scapegoat certain kids because they were too fat or something. But scapegoating happened. And so that increased his passion for democracy. So the early T groups embodied all those aspects. And I was in them. In 53, again in 54, in 56, in 57, I was in a 3-week trainer training with Ronald Lippett, and Lee Bradford was there, Ken Benny was there. It was a profound experience in my life. And then in the 1960s, I became the director of laboratory education, we called it, which meant that workshop in which we learn as a laboratory from what experiences we have, and then a key part of that is called the T group in that experience. And it was always 2 weeks, there was always 15 people to a group, and sat around tables. There were strict things about it that are rather quaint as we think about it. Now in the 60s, the T group was very popular. Life magazine featured a huge article about it and called it sensitivity training. Well, sensitivity was accurate if you meant sensitivity to the unconscious processes that are happening in the group. Like, am I sensitive that I'm talking about this subject because this person brought it up, but maybe I don't even want to be talking about it. Am I conscious about all the factors I mentioned earlier? How decisions be made, influence, all this. And that's what we were to be sensitive to. It wasn't, sensitivity training came on to mean sort of psychological meanings later. In fact, what happened was it became so popular that a lot of psychologists discovered it and psychotherapists discovered it, and they then started to lead these groups in the 60s without being trained. So they went, of course, for their strength, which was therapy. So the groups often turned into therapy groups working on the personal dimension and lost the capacity for group processes. I had a very dear friend who I very much wanted to have a T group experience, and she went to a T group in the 70s, this was, and I found out when she came home that she had been led by a psychiatrist, actually. It was an NTLT group, but it was led by a psychiatrist. And so as we talked about it, I heard a lot about the week. I discovered that the psychiatrist had taken each person. Now let's talk about your life history, and that's what they do. Nobody interacted. They went around, he went around one by one. There was very little interaction. And I said, what about group processes? She said, oh, yeah, at the end of the week, he said, if you're interested in group process, there's some papers on the back table. So at least for him, and I have evidence that it's far more than for him. The original scope of the T group was lost, and now often called encounter group or other names, but never mind, even in some T groups, that scope was lost. Training was not in, and when people tried to take that kind of a training to industry, it failed miserably, of course. I mean, you can't go to industry and do therapy groups. I mean, in industry, the reason what we do now succeeds so well, people get it the first day, oh, this stuff all fits for work, the way we do it. They don't, I mean, so we've learned a lot, but that's now. Let me go on a little bit. So by the end of the 70s, OD, which was tied to T group, the T group, and OD, which was tied to T group, had pretty well, was pretty well diminished. And it should have been, because, repeating that, you just could not take even the classic T group and just dump it on an industry, let alone the new, more therapeutic emphases, minus all the other stuff, even dealing good with social conflicts, or certainly democracy, or all that, and or frankly, bottom line results, because that's why industries were doing this. Now, I did some T groups in the 60s. I was on the national staff of the Methodist Church, in charge of these, and I did them all the time. We probably did one a month for 5 years. It was an amazing time. And I always had great people with me. I had a good budget. So, you know, I'd have a Goodman Watson, who edited Journal of Applied Behavioral Science for years. I just had some amazing people I could hire to co-train. So I kept in a co-training mode. It was a wonderful time. And during that time, I also did some work outside, like for instance for ABIS training. But the T groups there were sponsored by ABIS training, but they weren't really intact groups in ABIS. And anyone could come. Like I remember a group where I had 3 stewardesses and some other folks. I especially remember the stewardesses, because back in those days, the folks, to be a stewardess, you just had to be drop-dead gorgeous. And what I began to learn over the years about men and women who are drop-dead gorgeous is that on the 5B instrument, and just in a nutshell, it has 3 dimensions. One of them is emotionality, or openness, or affection, it's called in the Old English sense. But emotionality, that often people who were drop-dead gorgeous would have a very low score in terms of that they give it, and a very high score in terms of wanting it. so that people would think, they would say things like they're cold. Well, they weren't cold at all. They really wanted affection. But they weren't giving it. And they had learned that if they gave it, they sometimes got too much back in terms of the way people responded to them as handsome, beautiful people in the world. But nevertheless, so the Amos trainings were fascinating, but they weren't industry-adapted trainings. They were trainings that Amos did because he believed in T groups and he let people come. And that's good, but it's not what we're into today, which is taking the T group and applying it directly to the work world. Anyway, in '65 then, NTL decided they would start doing an OD intern. So I went to NTL for a month's training. Goodwin Watson turned out to be my T group trainer. The other key trainer in our group was Warner Burke, and he had the other T group. But we were a month-long, basically, T group. At times we would have guests like Will Schutz, or John and Joyce Weir, Chris Argyris, Blake and Mouton, the grid management, but actually Robert Morton in grid management. But we would, it was a fascinating month. It was a marvelous month. But again, here's NTL doing an OD intern, and what's at the core of it? The T group. So, to skip way ahead in this conversation, I'm saying you want to be an OD practitioner, involve yourself in some T groups. They're still available. And they're still available, I believe, with quality. And I've listed other places where they're available. We offer 2 stranger groups a year. Most of ours are done in companies. And so therefore, they're not, we only have 2 that are strangers. But I'd say get involved in at least a couple T groups. And of course I would say ours ought to be one of the 2 because we're the ones, as far as I know, most working to apply this to industry. The others are more classic, and they're wonderful to be in. The classic T group was a great learning experience, but it fell short in people being able to take it back and apply it in their work.